Good evening again, and welcome to Bedtime with Bernie. Tonight, we're reading chapter 1 from his book, It's Okay to Be Angry at Capitalism. All right, let us begin. The chapter is called Not Me, Us. The 2020 campaign and the fight to transform our country. On April 8th, 2020, which was my birthday, by the way, after almost 14 months of competing for the Democratic presidential nomination, I announced that we were suspending the campaign. The important message in the statements I made that day was while this campaign is coming to an end, our movement is not. Given the growing COVID-19 pandemic and social distancing requirements that effectively ended in-person campaigning, I made the announcement through a live stream from my home. I was deeply moved that some 7 million people ended up viewing it. During my remarks, I chose to focus less on the practicalities of a campaign that had fallen short in the delegate count and more on the historic nature of what we had accomplished. I cannot in good conscience continue to mount a campaign that cannot win and which would interfere with the important work required of all of us in this difficult hour. I explained, but let me say this very emphatically. As you all know, we have never been just a campaign. We are a grassroots, multiracial, multi-generational movement, which has always believed that real change never comes from the top down, but always from the bottom up. Our campaign was like none other in modern American history, built on the foundation of a 2016 bid that had proposed a political revolution. We forged a grassroots working class movement that was national in character, in which sought to overcome the overwhelming barriers to progress in the Democratic Party and the broader politics of the United States. I ran, as had been the case since my first campaign almost 50 years earlier, as a democratic socialist who was ready and willing to take on the oligarchs, the plutocrats, and the billionaire class that had turned our economic system into their plaything. But this time was different. While my ideas were still dismissed as radical by the political elites and many in the media, I began the 2020 campaign with a base of supporters that numbered in the millions and was prepared to fight for fundamental change. By the time the campaign was done, we had taken on Wall Street and the enormously powerful economic interests that control not just the economy, but the politics of our nation. We had challenged the billionaire class and the corporate elite, their media, and their super PACs. We had taken on the political establishment in both major parties. From the start, we achieved victories that shocked the pundits. We won the popular vote in the first 3 primary states on the way to securing almost 10 million votes nationwide for a campaign that was suspended for more than 2 dozen primaries. Let me say that again. From the very start, we achieved victories that shocked the pundits. We won the popular vote in the first 3 primary states on the way to securing almost 10 million votes nationwide for a campaign that was suspended before more than 2 dozen primaries were held. We won California, yes, and I was there, the most populous state in the country by more than 450,000 votes. For a time, we led the national polls not only in the race for the Democratic nomination, but in a head-to-head matchup against Donald Trump. And we built a movement powered by young people who were prepared to trudge through the snow, to knock on doors in northern New Hampshire, and to sweat through 90-degree days in South Texas. We had organized the most ambitious, most successful progressive presidential campaign in the century. Our ideas, which just a few years earlier had been dismissed as too extreme to be politically viable, had become part of the mainstream Democratic Party agenda. Our supporters and allies had begun to be elected to seats in Congress and to chair state parties. We had expanded political consciousness and had gotten millions of Americans to embrace a new understanding of what they had a right to expect from their government. Most important for the long term, as a result of our campaign, young people were participating in the political process at an unprecedented rate. It turned out that our ideas and our movement were, in fact, the future of the Democratic Party. While poll after poll showed us doing more poorly than we'd hoped with other older voters, those same polls showed that we were swamping the other candidates among younger voters, winning overwhelming support from Black, Latino, Asian American, Native American, and white voters under age 40. What was striking was that these young people were not only voting for us, they were the foundation of our grassroots campaign. They were the ones handing out literature, making phone calls, texting, raising small contributions, and volunteering in 100 different ways. Our campaign attracted a new generation of voters because we revolutionized modern presidential politics. At a time when virtually all campaigns were funded by super PACs and the very rich, we broke that long established mold and created an entirely new approach to raising sufficiently large sums of money to run a truly national presidential campaign. We did not hold one fundraiser in a billionaire's mansion. We did not seek the support of a super PAC. Our campaign was fueled by the working class teachers, postal clerks, Amazon warehouse workers, nurses, small business owners, farmers, and veterans, with more than 2 million individual donors making 10 million contributions that averaged $18.50. No campaign in American history had ever received that kind of support. We had revolutionized campaign financing, developing an entirely new model that rejected big money and put the people in control. The way we ran our campaign was intentional. We knew that to reach people who had grown justifiably cynical about politics, we had to abandon the practices that had caused tens of millions of Americans to lose faith in both major parties. We didn't just talk about rejecting the influence of big corporate money, although I did that a lot. We actually did. And we explained why it was absolutely necessary to reject greed-fueled corrupt corporate influence over elections. The simple math, as I said in every stump speech, is that no elected official is going to represent ordinary Americans and take on the special interests if they are beholden to big money. You can't receive campaign contributions from the pharmaceutical industry and lower the outrageous cost of prescription drugs. You can't rely on funding from the fossil fuel industry and combat climate change. You can't take big checks from the CEOs who have made their fortunes running non-union plants and then implement pro-worker labor laws. You can't do fundraising events with billionaires and help develop a fair and progressive tax system. Ultimately, of course, this country needs to enact fundamental campaign finance reforms to overturn the disastrous Supreme Court ruling in Citizens United and establish public funding of elections. But to get to that point where we can enact these reforms, candidates have to break free from the stranglehold of big money. And the only way to do that, as I learned a long time ago, is by relying on contributions from working class people. Our campaign showed it was possible to do this even at the level of presidential politics. Initially, we were told our approach was impractical, that it could never work. I knew that was wrong. So I went on social media and I wrote, I have a wild idea that I want to challenge you to help our campaign hit a goal that will absolutely astonish the political and financial establishment. People from all across the country responded, and political veterans were indeed astonished when our campaign raised $45 million in a single month. February 2020, with more than 2.2 million donations, the Guardian newspaper said we'd establish a gold standard for small dollar fundraising. I was enormously proud of what we had accomplished. I was prouder still of the legacy of our grassroots online fundraising efforts, which can be seen in the campaigns of a new generation of candidates, especially those running for Congress who have all rejected all corporate PAC money, basing their fundraising on small donations, ensuring that they will never have to bend to pressure from big money interests. Seizing political power of social media. It was not just our fundraising efforts that fundamentally changed presidential politics. It was our new approach to social media. It was extremely important for us to get out our ideas, new and unfamiliar to many people, as far and wide as we could. Our hardworking staff developed innovative social media and live stream platforms that communicated directly to tens of millions of Americans, allowing us to reach people without having to rely on corporate media, which was unfriendly when the campaign began and grew downright hostile as it progressed. Of course, I did a zillion newspaper and radio interviews with mainstream media outlets, and it appeared on every Sunday morning and late night network television talk show. But social media provided me the opportunity to go beyond the usual 12-second sound bites and speak in a detail with Americans about the big issues in their lives. From the start, our campaign had far more Facebook and Instagram interactions than any of the other candidates. In an April 2019 Newsweek headline announced, Bernie Sanders is the most popular 2020 Democrat on social media. While I still had work to do to catch up with Trump, we were clearly in the process of getting there. By February 2020, I had more than 11.5 million Twitter followers and more than 5 million Facebook followers. During the campaign, it was not uncommon for a 2-hour rally in Iowa, New Hampshire, or Nevada, which may have drawn 2,000 people to the actual venue, to be viewed by 250,000 people via live stream. This was revolutionary in the history of political communications. People were now being exposed on new political ideas and new ways of campaigning day after day, week after week. With these large crowds that we often drew, Americans could see with their own very eyes that there was nothing fringe about our efforts. They were discovering that we were not alone in seeking fundamental social and political change. Speaking to voters in their own languages. While we developed new approaches to fundraising and social media, we did not ignore old-style politics. Our campaign knocked on millions of doors. We went on to communities that were rarely, if ever, visited by candidates. In particular, we went to the low-income neighborhoods that have always been neglected by politicians and strategists. We wanted to meet people where they lived. Our belief from the very start was that this campaign was about reconnecting the people who had given up on the political process and about making new connections with people who had never been a part of it. For example, pundits asked why our campaign went out of its way to visit Native American reservations in 2016 and again in 2020, and to meet with representatives of the tribes. My answer was that we were going to open up conversations with people who had for too long been ignored. In North Dakota, supporters like State Representative Ruth Buffalo, an enrolled citizen of the Mandan, Haidestat, and Arikara Nation, and the first Native American Democrats woman elected to that state's legislature, took the message to urban and rural communities with large Native populations. Thanks to Ruth and others like her, we won a majority of the overall vote statewide, and we secured over 75% of the vote in Cannonball, where members of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe mounted mass protest against the Dakota Access Pipeline. We wanted to connect with new voters in ways that worked for them. Our goal is to talk to people where they're at in language they understand, said Supreet Kaur, the National Asian American and Pacific Islander organizer for the campaign. And to that end, we translated our campaign materials into at least 11 Asian languages, including Mandarin Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese, Tagalog, Hindi, and Punjabi. Spanish language materials, advertisements, and campaigning at front doors and workplaces were critical to our victories in a number of states. In the Nevada caucuses, for instance, we won 53% of the Latino vote. The next closest candidate, Joe Biden, got 16%. That did not happen by accident. Our Latino organizers developed strong outreach efforts within the communities where they were known and trusted. In addition, we invested in media designed to reach young Latinos who are almost always ignored politically, especially in California, where we worked with respected members of the diverse AAPI community. In Iowa, where African immigrants had become a major presence in the meatpacking industry, we hired staffers and brought in volunteers who spoke Ethiopian and Somali dialects so that we could appeal directly to these workers. As a satellite caucus in Ottumwa, Ethiopian immigrant workers showed up before their shift began and voted 14-1 in favor of our campaign, taking the message directly to the people. Just as we did our best to speak the language of voters, we sought to take our campaign to the places where they lived. Our rallies deviated from the normal route. They took candidates from one big city airport tarmac to the next. We went to more cities and towns than other candidates did, and we stayed longer. Our rallies lasted for hours because we didn't want to mouth a few talking points. We wanted to go into depth about what was really going on in the country. We had things to say, and we knew people had things to say to us. The truth is that I love campaigning and meeting people. While doing 3 or 4 rallies and town meetings a day can be tiring, it is also inspiring. Or 4 rallies and town meetings a day can be tiring, but also inspiring. I remember after a large rally in California when a young man grabbed my hand and said, "Senator Sanders, the reason I like you is that you treat us like we're intelligent human beings." In order to do that, we scheduled more events than any other campaign. During one stretch around the time of the Iowa caucuses, we were on the road for 45 consecutive days. But some estimates, a substantial majority of the people who voted for me in the first caucus and the primary states of Iowa and New Hampshire actually heard me speak. That is how democracy is supposed to work. I know that many people showed up at these events as committed supporters, and I suppose that at least some listened to me and then decided to vote for other contenders in the crowded field. But I'm convinced that we had won new supporters who got to hear a full discussion of the issues we were running on, and in many cases had the chance to ask questions about those issues. That was especially true in rural areas where Democrats have struggled in recent election cycles. While we certainly held plenty of rallies to the largest cities in America before huge crowds, in many cases, the largest turnouts these cities had seen in decades, we had also held town hall gatherings in small towns such as Orient, Iowa, population 368. It was near there that I met with hundreds of people at the homestead where former Vice President Henry Wallace was raised. I held similar events in neighboring counties and even smaller towns. In Iowa alone, we held well over 100 meetings in every region of the state, including towns of a few hundred people. These gatherings offered a reminder of something too many Democrats have forgotten. There are thousands of voters in rural areas all ready to engage with candidates who are prepared to listen to them. As the senator from the most rural state in the nation, I know that getting to rural areas can make take a little more time. Let me tell you, it's a long car ride to the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota and to Story City, Iowa. It's but it's worth the ride. Once you arrive at a place where people aren't used to seeing candidates for president, you make connections that cross lines of partisanship and ideology that help people re-engage with a political system they have come to feel with good cause has abandoned them. For a candidate who is willing to devote the time and energy of going that extra 50 miles down a country road, the experience can be deeply moving and highly instructive. Unlike our large rallies, which had sophisticated sound systems, music, and other guest speakers, and were attended by a lot of media, the rural events we did in early caucus and primary states were low key and down to earth, nothing fancy. We would rent a school gym or a church basement. I would welcome people to the event, say a few words, and be followed by a panel of local residents who spoke briefly about issues of community concern. At these meetings, we always tried to include immigrants, many of them whom were employed as farm workers or were opening businesses and revitalized neglected main streets. I also insisted that wherever possible, there be at least one young person in the panel. I thought it was important to hear their perspective, as I knew that young people in rural areas feel particularly alienated from politics. I wanted to see if we could overcome the alienation together, and often we did. After the panelists spoke, I'd answer questions and listen to comments. An hour or two later, following a lot of discussion, we headed on to the next town. But I remained in contact with the people from those communities, many of whom became enthusiastic and dedicated supporters of our campaign. Some of them even went to national conventions as Sanders delegates. Making these connections gets to the fundamentals of campaigning. I wanted their votes. They wanted to know if I would represent their interests. We talked and they made their decision. I must say that even at meetings where there were strong differences of opinion and where many of the interactions were always civil and respectful, it seemed to me to be a process that people enjoyed. Maybe that's because at some deep level, we all feel that this is what America is supposed to be about. What impressed me most about those town meetings and moved me emotionally was the willingness of people, often perfect strangers, to open up about their lives and share their pain, their anxiety, and the frustrations they have been experiencing. There were very few meetings where tears were not shed. Often I would start things off by saying, "Just give us your name and tell us your story." That was all it took. In Grundy Center, a man spoke about his anxiety over going to the hospital emergency room where he thought he was having a heart attack. He knew the tests were going to cost a fortune. And he said he kept worrying about dying and leaving his wife with a pile of medical debt. Then he sighed and said, "It's humiliating." The people around him nodded. A moment later, there was a more nodding when a woman talked about having to pay thousands of dollars in premiums each month to retain an inadequate health care plan that was linked to her husband's job. They didn't have the option of finding another plan, and she said, "I'm not healthy." The woman quietly explained, "We can't do other things." In Decorah, a woman who had been paying $17.50 a month, that's $1,750 a month for health insurance, explained how her life changed when she was finally able to enroll in Medicare. I asked if she found our proposed for Medicare for All system and which would serve people of all ages appealing. Yes, she explained. Why don't people get it? The range of issues that people brought up offer a reminder of the wide variety of struggles facing working Americans. I'm a family farmer and I can't compete against corporate agriculture. Will I ever reunite with my husband who's been deported back to Mexico? I have an arrest record for smoking marijuana. That's crazy. I work full time, but I can't afford to take care of my kids on $9 an hour. I didn't realize I would leave college $50,000 in debt. How am I going to pay that off on the low wages that I make? Why does the school that my child attends, which is disproportionately Black, get less state funding than white schools? Our rallies and town meetings held in state after state ended up attracting thousands, hundreds of thousands of attendees, and millions more watched via live stream. We were making connections, and it was having an impact. Against a far crowded field than we'd faced in 2016, and with many other contenders adopting progressive stances, polls consistently showed that our campaign was in the top three. In key caucuses and primary states, we were on top at or near the top. A late September 2019 CNN poll had me tied with Joe Biden for first place in Nevada. And I was devoting as much time to that state with its large, diverse population as I was to the conditional first states of Iowa and New Hampshire. You're having a heart attack. On Tuesday evening in the start of October, I was meeting in Las Vegas with members of the Muslim community. Suddenly, for the first time in all my years of speaking in public, I realized I needed to sit down. I couldn't keep standing. We did the question and answer session, but I knew something was wrong. I felt I had to get out of there, and we cut the meeting short. When we got in the car, I said, "Let's go back to the hotel." But my aide, Ari Robin Hart, said, "No, I think we'd better go to a doctor's office." We went to an urgent care facility where the doctor told me, "You're having a heart attack." I couldn't believe it. In my ignorance, I thought that if I was having a heart attack, I would collapse, that I'd literally be on the floor. Instead, I was in an ambulance, headed to a hospital. Then I was surrounded by a team of doctors and nurses. The next thing I knew, I woke up in a hospital gown. A few hours later, my wife, Jane, who had been up all night and taken the first plane out of Burlington to Las Vegas, was at my side. We learned that I had had a procedure in which stents were placed in my arteries to open them up and restore blood flow. I didn't feel any real pain when I awoke the next morning. I was just very weak. In many respects, the heart attack was more a psychological blow than a physical blow. I had been blessed with great health all my life and couldn't believe that my body had failed me. I was very fortunate in that the care that I received at the Desert Springs Hospital Medical Center was excellent. The doctors explained what had happened, and I began learning more about cardiology than I ever wanted to know. The nurse helped me get back on my feet and walked with me around the corridors, which, though at first I still felt weak days after the surgery, I was also not much in the mood to answer many of the phone calls that were coming in. What did cheer me up, however, was getting a visit from my friend Harry Reid. the former majority leader of the U.S. Senate, who had recently retired as the senior senator from Nevada. In the midst of all of it I was going through, it was good to see an old friend. My heart attack was a big news story, and media interest in my medical condition was intense. Reporters and TV camera crews crowded around the hospital entrance, peppering anyone who appeared with questions. How serious was the attack itself? What kind of damage was incurred? Was Sanders dropping out of the race? If not, when was the 78-year-old candidate with a heart condition returning to the campaign trail? And what would that campaign look like? Immediately after my surgery, we really didn't know the answers to the political questions. Indeed, we had our own questions. Would I be strong enough? Whoops. I think I'm going to stop there. Would I be strong enough to continue the campaign? Could I do it full time and be fairly healthy? And in my condition, could I assure the American people that I would be healthy enough to manage the incredible, stressful responsibilities that go with serving as president of the United States? Being president in your 80s is one thing. Being president in your 80s with a heart condition, well, that's something else. As David Axelrod, a former top advisor to President Obama, said, the New York Times running for president is a physical and emotional trial, and the presidency itself is even more demanding. While we all wish Senator Sanders well, this has to be a big flashing light for him, and given his age, it may be for some voters as well. Axelrod was right; it was a flashing light, but not necessarily a flashing red light. With that, we'll stop. We hope you enjoy the reading. Join us tomorrow as we continue reading Bedtime with Bernie. Good evening.